Welcome to Grapple Arts Radio.
Hello everyone, this is Stefan Kesting from grapplearts.com. Today I've got one of my most influential instructors and my really good friend, Philip Gelinas from Montreal, Canada, on the line. And I'm so happy to be talking to you. How are you doing, Philip?
I'm doing really well, Stefan. How are you?
I'm very good. Now, one of the reasons I was first drawn to Philip when I met him was that not only was he really down to earth, but he's also super deprecating, which is why I, not you, are going to go through your list of achievements and the amount of certifications that you have for teaching martial arts, which is just incredible. The first martial art that you received your black belt in was a Japanese Kempo system, is that right?
That's correct.
Okay. And since then, you've become a 9th degree black belt in Kaji Kempo Karate. You're an instructor under Daniel Nasanto in Jeet Kune Do, in Silat, in the Filipino martial arts. You're one of the highest ranking students of Pakiti Tercia Kali, which is a Filipino martial arts system under Leo Gahe. I think you're certified in Muay Thai by a couple of different organizations. You're one of the original Dog Brothers, the full contact stick fighting guys out of California. You're an instructor in that system. You're one of the top tier fighters. You're a brown belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. You're an instructor in combat submission wrestling under Eric Paulson. And is that more or less it? Have I missed anything major?
I hope you haven't missed anything, but I don't think you have.
Okay. And just a couple days ago, you were inducted into the Black Belt Hall of Fame. So first of all, congratulations. That's an awesome achievement.
Well, I thank you very much.
How was that? How was the actual induction ceremony or the abduction ceremony?
Well, it was very interesting because every time I think about these things, I kind of think about that thing that Groucho Marx would write or he actually said to somebody who was asking him if he would join a local country club, and he said, "I don't want to become a member of any club that would have me as a member." And I just sort of thought, well, that's kind of what I feel because, that's just, I don't know, I just can't, I'm not into that kind of stuff. So anyway, I kind of learned to absorb and accept it. It was really quite spectacular. John Terrien, who, besides being a high-ranking jiu-jitsu black belt, was also Jean-Yves Thériault, the Iceman's manager for many years, or still is, was organizing this thing in Ottawa this past weekend, and it was amazing. There were about 1,000 participants who came to the dinner. It was really quite spectacular. There are only 8 people who ever get inducted every year, so I thought to myself, well, how on earth did I fall through the cracks and get elected? And it was really kind of surprising.
The real question is, how did you avoid getting abducted for so long?
Well, it turns out this thing has only been going on for a few years, and the people would come up to me and say, "Oh, wow, I've been trying to get you in here for a long time," and I go, and it just was hard for me to imagine that was true because we keep a pretty low profile, and even though we do things. We think we do things at a pretty decent level. Just because you do something at a decent level doesn't mean you're going to get any kind of public acknowledgement of that. So you don't do it for that reason. You do it because you're looking to be the best you can be in what you're looking to do, and nothing. The other part, if you start worrying about, if people like you or how big a thing you're going to win if you go to a tournament on a Saturday, then you're going to invariably find yourself depressed because I won a bunch of those tournaments in the past, and eventually I left all of those trophies on the side of the road because, tin and plastic doesn't really make an awful lot of memories that last. And it's the memories that are more important than that stuff anyway. So.
Well, and your legacy with your students, of which you've had thousands and thousands over the years, you've certainly got one of the premier schools in Eastern Canada. And certainly in Montreal, you've met just about anybody who's anybody, and you've had an awful lot of big names train with you over the years.
Yeah, it's actually been kind of surprising. It was funny because when you get them when they're training, you don't really relate to the fact that such and such is here, or wow, that person over there, they're really well known for doing this, because you just get to the point where you start realizing that they are just human beings. I think one of the things that helped me in the 70s, I was involved with some people from high school, and one of them got involved in rock and roll touring, and I was working for a local promoter, and then I went on the road for a few years from 1977 till about 1981, and it was actually kind of funny because I mean, my first tour I ever went on was with Black Sabbath. And in those days, I mean, it's kind of funny because Black Sabbath is now really cool. Everybody wants to know what it was like to train, like to hang out with Black Sabbath. In those days, you didn't actually say that to anybody because, if you were what you considered a mainstream music listener, you would, you were listening to Eric Clapton, you were listening to, Jimi Hendrix, and it was kind of like Black Sabbath was kind of like that stuff that, nobody ever listened to and never made it to any radio stations. And so, I mean, they were great guys, but, you weren't going to go and say, wow, I'm on tour with Black Sabbath. You were, you're going, wow, yeah. What are you doing? Well, I'm on tour. What? Who with? Oh, we're playing at the Palladium. Oh, what band? We're tonight at 8:00. And so, and then people say, you're going, and what are you doing? Well, I'm on tour with Black Sabbath. And, so I know it was snobbery. It was kind of reverse snobbery. But nowadays it's really funny because, my son thinks it's the greatest thing in the world that I worked with them, and, it's kind of amusing because, in those days it was kind of like, wow, yeah, these guys, I mean, there was a brilliant thing. I mean, Black Sabbath in those days were, they were managed by a very, very smart guy, and he was able to get them on the road. But, when you see what rock and roll is like nowadays, you go, wow, these guys were, they were doing it the right way. It wasn't bad at all. But anyway, as a result of seeing these guys and seeing all the people they were with, you got to see an awful lot of things that martial arts are the same way. I mean, there are people who do things really well, and they just happen to be raised in the vision of somebody. Somebody decides that this guy over here is really great, and gosh, I wish I was like him, and I wish I knew him really well. And you realize that, well, that may be true, but, above and beyond anything else, there are people who, if they want to get better or stay good, they've got to practice. And I had a facility where they would come and they would train. And so, as a result, I got to know a few of them, I won't say really well, but well enough that they would remember me if they walked past me on the street.
Would you be referring to Georges St. Pierre, David Loiseau, Patrick Cote, and those other MMA fighters?
Yeah, in Montreal. I mean, when George started training with at our school, I mean, George was really good. But he was primarily a Kyokushin fighter, and he was working with his friend Christophe Midou, and who was also a Kyokushin fighter, but he was from France, and he really stimulated George to do some stuff. And then when I hired one of the first black belts in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu who came to Montreal and started training, well, George came by because they were looking to get their Jiu-Jitsu better. And so Christophe and George and then eventually all the other guys came down to the school. And eventually George got his blue belt from Wagner through the Novignal group. And then things just went on from there. And George was with us for quite a while. And then when he left after Wagner left, and we got another Brazilian black belt in, and then George came back and was with us for a while, and then but it was the same thing. I mean, like when you have a lot of people who are advising you, which is talking in your ear and trying to get you to do what they think you should do, as opposed to somebody else thinks you should do, you eventually get things happen. And so George left. He left us, and then he got his, he left us and got his brown belt from someone else, and then he came back and trained with us for a while, and then he left us again, and he got his black belt, and he hasn't trained at our school since that time.
Mm-hmm. And you haven't toured with Black Sabbath in the recent past either?
And I don't know where. I've been waiting for that phone call to come, but they just haven't bothered calling. So
I'll put a good word in for you. So
Thanks.
So then this would have been an interesting stage in George's career, because he had already been fighting at this point, but he was, I wouldn't say was the complete fighter yet that he is now.
Well, actually, it's, if you look at the way George's techniques worked, the most definitive work that we did on his stuff, I mean, in the beginning when he was working with Wagner, he was basically learning just the ins and outs. I mean, like, the side control, the arm bar, the rear naked choke. It's just the standard lexicon of terms that you have to learn if you're going to do it. When he came back to us again, what he was able to do is, because he already had done pretty well as far as learning how to do those basic techniques, and then he started doing, the people started getting better. I mean, at the beginning, it was, when you saw Hoist in the UFC, it was just like, is he going to do a choke or is he going to do an arm bar? I mean, there was not much choice. This was going to happen to you or that. And then people got better, and then all of a sudden he couldn't do those things to you. And so now it became somebody would grab your arm and maybe we would try to do an omoplata instead of something else, or maybe they'd go and do this instead of something else. And so when we were teaching George specific counters to specific techniques, and I would say that the stuff he learned in those days seems to have been what has stuck with him. I mean, he may be training with other people now, but the top game that he has had its early formations at our school.
Okay. Well, that's really interesting. And when you refer to Hoist, I mean, not to take anything away from the man, but that really was the triumph of technique over athleticism. And now we're dealing with fighters like, John Jones, George St. Pierre, who are not only very, very technical, but also super athletes. They would do well in other sports as well.
Well, I think but that's the thing about it. That's, I think, one of the reasons. I mean, we all say that, that's something that's come about. But I mean, when Art Davies and Horan Gracie first put together the idea of this, it was based on what was happening in Brazil up to that time. I mean, they had the Vale Tudo fighting, and all these guys were fighting in Brazil, and it was kind of wild and crazy. But to appeal to the American audience, which is what it was all about with the UFC, you had to really give them something different. And you had to, of course, he had Rickson Gracie, who was a also great MMA fighter and great jiu-jitsu fighter. But if you put him up against all these guys and he won, everyone would go, yeah, but look at him. This guy's really buff. He's built. He's like awesome fighter. Of course he's going to win. I mean, there's no big surprise. He would have won anyway, even if he was just a soccer player. So by putting Hoist in his kimono, a tall, not gangly, but definitely not packed with, all those muscles all the other guys had, and he was still able to take all of them down and basically submit them all one after the other, and as a result, successfully defend the title that Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu saw for itself. I mean, we have to realize that up to that time, the Gracies had some standing challenges in the Los Angeles area where they had their schools that they would take on anybody at any time, and that was successful at getting them some action.
Pretty badass.
Breaking. Say again.
Pretty badass.
Yeah, it was pretty badass, and you can still get an awful lot of those videotapes where somebody would go in there and there'd be some guy, and there were a lot of really, really well-known karate guys who took the challenge and found themselves wanting, and I was actually very fortunate because I was listening to that, and I had the same things of the other guys. Say, oh yeah, well, and of course we all had this idea that yes, given the opportunity, we could win. Little realizing that what the Gracies did was, and they'd come up with this plan, this technique and it was based on fighting people who were trying to fight them, and they came up with this idea of how to make this stuff work. And there was nobody at that time who had a really, really good plan to counter it. And so for the first two UFCs, these guys were awesome, and they were just like nobody could beat them. But by the fourth and fifth, by that time, the other guys were starting. It's not like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu got crushed to the dust, but there was no longer that kind of one-sided superiority. The learning curve was really steep, but it was acquired. American fighters went from being like, what's happening? The wrestlers would not want to go to their backs, and now went to their backs. The guys who would do stuff, the strikers learned how to strike. I remember Demetrius Demetrius Edwards, the kickboxer, had his he was the first guy that actually started successfully doing it. Then the wrestlers started bringing the ground and pound, and these are certain aspects that had never been thought of before. And these guys changed the face. I mean, yes, the wrestlers were able to come in and do the clinch game, but they substantially changed the game. Even though, had it not been for the wrestling, or not the wrestling, had it not been for the jiu-jitsu, the situation never would have been a discussed point. But now strikers can strike they can strike, and they can have a striking fight. But if they didn't have any grappling to speak of, they would be taken down at will by somebody who knew. So it was it was a really, really brilliant move on their part. They were able to bring their art to North America, and they were able to get it well known in a really, really quick period of time. And I mean, look at them now. If you want to see successful martial arts companies, look at a Brazilian jiu-jitsu factory, if you'll excuse that pun, because they're turning people out, left, right, and center, and they're getting the better athletes, and they're going in, and you can have kind of lazy fighters, and you can have great athletic fighters, but they have tournaments, and they do well. And if you go back to Brazil, I mean, they've got a very successful judo team that have competed in world and Olympic events, and most of those guys have had a lot of experience in the Brazilian jiu-jitsu on the ground. So there must be some connective tissue that seems to be working.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the things that I was really looking forward to talking to you about is actually not really related to MMA competition per se, and that's with the Kajikembo that I trained with you for years. It was very much a self-defense system. And when people talk about the other martial arts, most of the other martial arts that you do, say the Filipino martial arts, the Kali, the Silat, again, people think of them mostly as self-defense systems, right?
Right.
And the tendency now is to look at Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu as kind of a niche sport that has some influence on MMA. But what about the connection between Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and I guess submission grappling in general with self-defense? How do you see that connection of the ground and the stand-up self-defense for somebody who's never planning to step into a ring or step into an octagon, but still wants to be able to handle stuff when stuff goes badly in the street?
Well, I guess the one thing that, we all try to put situations into the contextual reference points that seem to suit ourselves better. And so now you have, if you were to look at the historical background, the self-defense aspects of Gracie Jiu-Jitsu have always been there. I remember attending the first seminar that Horion and Hoyce gave in Montreal back in, I could have been 84, 85, I don't remember exactly when. There were about 300 people in the floor of a boxing school. The promoters had to borrow mats from everybody, my school included, because there was just so much floor space and so many people wanted it. And they taught, over a day, they taught like 4 techniques. One technique of you put your hand on the floor and then you step your foot back and you leave your other hand forward, and you're not allowed putting, or you have to stand up without putting your hand on the floor. And it was an arm bar and something almost nothing involved. And you just go, wow, this is they're not going to teach very much. And I guess they planned to have a 20-year plan to learn to teach jiu-jitsu, and then everybody else, of course, started teaching it everywhere. I remember seeing some tapes, and there were some guys going, there's more than 4 times as many techniques as taught by those other guys, so it was like that. But I think what happened is that the self-defense was always a very strong part. The stories you hear about the bridge, not the bridge, but the beaches in Rio de Janeiro, and you go to the Copacabana bridges, it's like, or beaches, whenever there would be a fight between a jiu-jitsu guy and somebody else, there'd be a scrum. Everybody would be screaming around and screaming, jiu-jitsu, or whatever it was going to be, that luta libre and all those things. And so the self-defense thing was always part of it, because it was always fighting. They would fight in tournaments, and that would be kind of like the recreation. But, the stories I've heard from most of these guys is that they fought all the time. Enemies was sometimes 30 guys against 30 guys. Sometimes it was one guy against 10 guys. So a lot of times, what people are finding out now, this idea that, you are going to go to the ground and start choking somebody out, part of it, I think, is that, these guys literally learned how not to go to the ground. If you were fighting 10 guys and, you got a choice. Okay, I could break one arm or choke one guy out, and then I'm on my back. I have this dead weight on top of me or something, and all of his friends are using me as soccer practice. And quite honestly, Americans kind of don't realize this, but in other countries other than those in North America, kicking with feet is a very natural, almost instinctive reaction because that's their major sport and that's what they do all the time. And so
I hear those Brazilians are pretty good at soccer.
This head as a soccer ball, they're probably less inclined to do it because whenever they've had the chance, to win every one of the 10 instead of the one, I'm sure they're just as, trying to score that goal just as easily as anybody else. And so I guess, what's happened now is that people, in a fighting thing, if you're a jiu-jitsu guy, of course you want to grab the guy and you want to pull him to the ground and put him in your guard or get on top of him and choke him out or do whatever it is you're going to do. But a lot of these guys are fighters and have been fighters since they were 4 years old. And I'm not talking about fighters in jiu-jitsu. They were in fighters in street fights. And so they know that that's not what you do. But of course, if you're marketing something, you're not going to market it to say, this is going to work really great, except for, so you're going to tell everybody this works all the time. And, even though you may not always do it, you're going to say that it works because it's a smart thing to do. But, nowadays, of course, everybody goes, there's no way that would work. And, they would bring up, how could you use jiu-jitsu against an atom bomb? That's ridiculous. But, it's not going to stop people from saying, yes, our jiu-jitsu works even against atom bombs. So it's the same kind of marketing. If you insist on something, I'm sure there are enough people out there that will believe it. Look at some of the stuff people buy on the internet, for goodness sakes.
Mm-hmm. Well, you started out this conversation by saying that people always create scenarios that present themselves or their abilities in the best light. Mm-hmm. And so, the combatives people who learn a bunch of super deadly killing techniques but never actually try it out on anybody are always talking about this hypothetical street that's, full of syringes and broken glass. And, there's always a multi-person attack scenario. And, oh, by the way, the guy has, HIV and AIDS and leprosy and Ebola. I live in a city that's got a fair IV drug use problem. There's a lot of drug users around. I actually don't see syringes on the sidewalk every day. And if it did go to the ground, I think you've got more pressing concerns than worrying about, a piece of broken glass. I think your adrenaline will take care of that. Not to say that you should go there, but if you do end up there, God, you do need to have some kind of a plan.
Well, I think that's exactly it. Your situation, a lot of people go to the ground in spite of whatever you're thinking about. All of that stuff, you don't want necessarily go to the ground, but let's say, you're walking somewhere and you trip, and so you find yourself on the ground. And so what are you going to do? Say, hey, just a second, let me up. This isn't fair. We should fight fair. Of course, no one's going to ever say that. They're going to take, they're going to be like a pack of hyenas. If they think that they can get you, they will get you. But just the same way, even though, on these nature shows, we always see these, either the moose or the deer, and there's some pack of wolves or some lions, and they're always attacking, and it's always much more spectacular to see the lions, taking the gazelle down by the neck, and all these little lion cubs eating, and or whatever they do. But I would probably say that if this was true, that this happened every time, there wouldn't be any gazelles. Because they'd all be dead, right? Because they're all stupid and they all get caught every time they get attacked, which is not true. So, most lions, spend an awful lot of time trying to hunt. Why? Because they're not that successful. And the same thing with this. I remember watching a show and it said, the great white shark looks at a seal as 30,000 calories. And maybe they only have 5,000 calories of energy that they can use in trying to catch the seal. So they're basically trying to trade up for more calories. And, sometimes they don't succeed. And so that's the thing. There's, the seals are there, and maybe we'll look at them as people are, walking down the street. So even though that there's tons and tons of people who, we always look at that and say, okay, well, this is going to happen. But as you say, if somebody attacks me, I'd say the biggest problem people have when it comes to being attacked is this stupidity we all seem to manifest when we all kind of have this duh idea. It's like most people can avoid problems just by looking around them. And so, yes, you may run into this, but I mean, most people I know that that have been in some kind of street fight, if they've had any kind of training, they've used that training to their advantage. If but most people, just look and say, okay, well, I've been doing this martial art, fill in the blanks, doesn't matter which one, for a long time, and I should be able to handle this. I mean, I remember reading a karate magazine years ago, and somebody was talking about Mike Tyson and how, he should be easily taken care of. After all, I am a Shodan, and I know that 7 pounds of pressure will break your knees, so as a Shodan, I'll easily stop Mike Tyson with a side kick to the knee and stop him dead in tracks.
Good luck with that.
Yeah, exactly. Well, exactly. So there's that, and then there's the people who go, a lot of smart people, and most of the philosophies are like, you just walk away. I mean, but it's only people who, who think that they have to defend their honor, whatever the heck that is. But there's that old adage that we use. It's a Kajukenbo adage, right? It's not who's right, it's who's left. Well, there's that is, or better to fight and run away than live to fight another day. There's all these little things that we think are very funny. Now, I think that, when it comes down to it, if I'm being attacked by 2 or 3 guys and I slip, then I'll probably try to get to my feet. In the stuff that we do, there's an awful lot of the self-defense things that tell us, yeah, this is what you have to do. If you go to the ground and you stay there, well, you're probably going to be used as a soccer ball. But the most time I've ever seen is like, even people who are just grapplers, when it comes to 2 or 3 people, they're swinging for the fences. They're not trying to do arm bars and chokes there, or if they're doing an arm bar, it's just to hold the guy in front of them so that will be the person that they hit instead of the guy who they're trying to hit. So it's a tough call, because you want to be able to say, yes, my technique will work in all situations, but the reason that a style or a system is created is because it's referencing a particular situation, a particular set of circumstances. I mean, look at the Maginot Line. It was a brilliant idea as long as it was applied in the First World War, but since it wasn't, it didn't really work very well afterwards because the techniques and the tactics changed. But a lot of martial arts are kind of like Maginot Lines. So that, yeah, well, we always harken back and say, well, back in the 18th century, the attack method was there, so we're developing a technique perpetually based on the attacks of this person to this person, in the battlefield of, Eastern Prussia. And they go, well, that's nice, but it's not necessarily valid today. And I think that's a real situation that we have to deal with, so that, of course, the jiu-jitsu guys would probably say, yes, you should go to the ground. And the other guy who's actually on the ground is going, no, we should get up and I should run away, or I should do something else. And so things are fluid and they are liquid and they change.
So if we take MMA as a martial art, I know there's no martial art called MMA, but there's a certain convergence there of techniques and strategies. How applicable in your mind is training MMA to self-defense? Would you recommend it to somebody who wants to get better at self-defense?
I would say it's very, very good. I mean, why? Because the first rule of self-defense, if you were to use any of those Bruce Lee analogies, is physical conditioning. I mean, one of the things that he found when there was that article, I never met the man, so everything I'm doing is just paraphrasing what people have told me about this, but he supposedly fought somebody, and that person he beat, but he didn't beat them in the style to which he thought he could have. And he realized that the reason for that was because he was physically out of shape. And that's a big problem, in that if you don't have the conditioning, you are going to probably lose that fight, because it doesn't matter what you know technically. If you don't have the ability to execute it, you're not going to do it. Like if you think you can wrestle and you try to wrestle, one of the things, we have a wrestling class at our school, and one of the things you realize is that the people who are out of shape don't do so great. They do really well for the first 30 seconds, but if the other guy's got any skills, well, you're going to have a long evening. Well, in MMA, one of the things, you run, you spar, you do things, you wrestle, you do jiu-jitsu, you strike, you use all those muscles in the ways that they need to be used. And quite honestly, those ways are very, very how can I say, they're demanding of your body. You know, you
Mm-hmm.
may be able to side kick, you may be able to round kick, you may be able to knee, you may be able to do a single leg, a double leg, a high crotch, use all those things and ankle pick the guy, and you know, do a side control and a top guy, you know, a mount and do all those things. But if you don't have it, if you don't have whatever it takes to go more than a minute or two, you're gonna, you know, your energy is just gonna die, and you're gonna be sort of like, you know, it's like trying to hold your breath underwater. Yeah, you know, you may even be good at this. I can hold it for 30 seconds, 35 seconds. After a certain point, the air in your lungs starts becoming non-oxygenated anymore, and you start struggling because then you start realizing that you're now fighting against not only the fact that the person's fighting you, but you're fighting against the fact that you don't have any more oxygen. So those guys in MMA fights are, for the most part, in much better shape than the people they're going to run into. So, as a self-defense, that's probably one of the better ones I can imagine.
Mm-hmm. The as you were talking there, I just recalled something, and I'm wondering if you've seen this. There was a clip on YouTube a while ago of this dude who was going out to pick a fight with his neighbor. It was some kind of parking dispute, if I remember correctly. So he set up the camera, goes outside, and the next thing you know, his neighbor picks up a shovel and hits him with the shovel. And he spends the next 5 minutes beating on the guy who's on the ground with the shovel. And you would think that that would kill whoever was on the ground, because, I mean, it was just a couple skinny guys. But the guy on the bottom was laying on his back and picking off the shovel shots with his feet. I don't know if he'd been trained or if this was just instinctive, or if he thought, like, better that he hits the bottom of my feet than the top of my head with that heavy metal object. And he survived, because of essentially the guard. And I wish I could find this clip. If somebody listening to this can find it, shoot me an email and I'll put it in this interview, because it was such a fascinating application of you can't use jiu-jitsu, you can't use the guard. What if there's weapons? Well, this is exactly a case where this saved this guy's ass against a weapon. Have you seen this clip?
No, I haven't seen it. But I didn't realize that there was such a perfect illustration of what I was talking about. But yeah, but the thing is that if the guy was really tired, he eventually would have not been able to hold his leg up to stop the guy. Mm-hmm. So.
I think probably in that case, both guys. One guy's getting tired of swinging the shovel. The other guy's getting tired of.
Yeah.
But so then, where do you? If we're just talking from a self-defense context, and we're talking about grappling, whether that's no-gi grappling or gi grappling, what about the weapons aspect? Because I know you as a dog brother. Actually, I'll segue into this first, or I'll use this as an introduction first. You are a dog brother, and what that means to people who don't know is there's a bunch of crazy Californians who are training in the Filipino martial arts who decided to start testing what they knew in full contact stick fights. So it was a heavy rattan stick, a fencing helmet, hockey gloves, elbow pads, a cup, and not much else. And fairly quickly, from what I recall, they started blending. A lot of them were training with the machados at the time. Was that right?
Yes,
and they started blending the standing with the ground.
I met through Mark Denny, who is the crafty dog. He's the guiding force of the Dog Brothers. That's what they, instead of calling chief executive officer, I guess the guiding force is his name. Anyway, he introduced me to Higan Machado. He actually did it surreptitiously. He said, "Oh, I have a private lesson. Would you like to come by?" And I was there with my wife, and he said, "Well, sure. Let's go by and see this Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu stuff." We'd all heard about it, but of course hadn't seen anything up close and didn't know. And Mark was the first person to actually have been introduced to this outside of the group. And so he invited me over, and I met Higan Machado, and it was like, oh yeah. And then about half an hour, Mark decided that, well, really, I'm getting tired. I'm like, Philip, why don't you take the last half of the private lesson? So I went, okay, I'll do that. And I went over there, and I got turned into a pretzel. My wife thought it was hilarious to see me, and she took photographs of me being twisted around in things I now recognize as being omoplatas and, different things. But in those days, I didn't really know what they were. I didn't have a frame of reference. I didn't really start training in a grappling system at that time, and definitely not Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu because it was available in Los Angeles and maybe Brazil, but it wasn't really available anywhere else. And so as a result, there was there was less chance of me ever running into it. But Mark wanted me to see, and he actually wanted me to see if I could bring the Machados up to Montreal, and I tried. But of course, now it's very funny because if you know this area, we have so much Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu with what they say, you can't swing a stick without hitting a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu practitioner now. But back in 1992, the most familiar refrain is, we already have that. Because of course you can't tell them about Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu because you don't know what Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is. You're just telling them, wow, this guy turned me into a pretzel and I couldn't stop him and he's really good. And everybody goes, just because you suck doesn't mean we suck too. You know that, don't you? And so of course and of course having no frame of reference, you're going, I guess you're right. And anyway, so nobody was interested in having him up here, and that was combined with the general Brazilian ability to never answer a phone call if necessary. You'd call them and they'd never call you back, and they'd never call you back. And then 2 years later, they'd say, why didn't you ever call me? Hey, man, what's wrong with you? You were supposed to call me and you never call. Anyway, so that as a result, we never got them up here until the 90 after the UFC in '94, and then of course the long trip began. And we didn't get a Brazilian black belt here. We had some Brazilian blue belts who'd not Brazilian blue belts, but blue belts of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu had come up here. But was the first time was '98 that we actually got something. So it was like maybe about 8 or 9 years after the initial contact had been made. But it was
can you talk a little bit about how grappling is different when there's a stick or a knife involved?
Well, it's like anything. The grappling happens. That's if you're hitting with somebody with a stick, everybody goes. People say grappling doesn't happen. I said, look, if you're boxing, grappling happens. You may not wrestle to the floor, but when you have two boxers and when they get tired, you know what? They hang on to each other. You know what that's called? Grappling. Because you're not allowed to do it, they don't actually give it a real name, because then you'd have to give rules and you'd have to say, well, you're allowed or you're not allowed. But you're grappling, you're holding on to a guy, you hold on to his arms so he can't punch you, you rabbit punch him in the kidneys so he can't punch you, you punch him in the back of the head or whatever, then the referee stops you. But really, it enables you to get a little bit of a rest. And so people do it all the time. It's not foreign to, I would say you would very, very hard put to find a boxer who has not done that kind of grappling in his career at some point in time. Mm-hmm. So when you get to a stick, it's the same thing. So you're isolating the hand that has the weapon, be it a knife, be it a stick, be it a sword. And people go, yeah, but in a real fight, this would happen. And you go, most of these people who say that have never been in a real fight with a weapon. They can say what they want. Sure, you can get really close to somebody, and if they've got the knife and they're really pulling you closely, and they're, inserting the knife into various organs, of course, your argument is going to sound very true. Oh, you shouldn't do this. But if you have two people with longer weapons, and the biggest, the most dangerous place for you when somebody has a long weapon is at the end of that weapon. You either need to go farther away or a lot closer. And a lot closer seems to be a lot smarter sometimes, especially when running is exhausting. And so people would get really close, and it doesn't take much. All you have to do is do a little bit of historical study and see that the grappling stuff has existed in medieval stuff and in Japanese stuff. And what is jiu-jitsu created for? If the samurais always had these beautiful katanas with them, why did the jiu-jitsu exist? Well, because maybe it didn't exist all the time. People say, oh, well, it's only because they didn't want to spill blood on the emperor's lawn. I said, look, the emperor didn't have guests all the time. We're trying to kill each other. This jiu-jitsu existed in spite of that. And and all sorts of things existed in spite of that. And the idea that somehow there was some kind of code of honor about this. And yeah, sure, there was a code of honor. I do it until I get caught, and then I say, oh no, I'm too honorable. So that's same thing. When it comes to stuff like that, if you have a weapon, it'll happen. And so you can charge in. And another thing is that one thing is that people can say what they want, but bladed weapons have a tendency of getting dull. Now, for the most part, you can cut things. If you sit on somebody's face with a sword, you're probably going to cut it. But this idea, like when you hear the people, somebody get, you hear or see a razor going, and that's the sound it makes as it slices open your thigh. Okay, but I mean, in the 70s we used to have a lot of doormen that were training with us in various things, and I'd hear stories about people, and there's one guy was at some after hours club, and this guy we wouldn't let him in, and he was the guy attacked him, and he didn't really feel anything. The guy sliced him twice with a razor, and he didn't when he moved he felt his thighs all wet, and that's only the reason he knew, because it didn't really. It's not like or when you hear people getting into a fight, and somebody I was doing some stuff and he kept punching me in the ribs, and it turned out later he wasn't getting punched, he was getting stabbed, but somehow the grapple still happened. So to say that make ridiculous statements that that doesn't happen, it's based on wishful thinking, because it's sure as heck not based on documented fact, because that's just not true.
And certainly the Dog Brothers have developed specific chokes or attacks to do. I'm more familiar with the stick end of things, but I've ended I'm not a Dog Brother, but I have done full contact stick fighting, and certainly the fang choke has ended a fair number of matches. That's a one vicious attack, and there's a whole bunch of other chokes and arm locks and manipulations that you can do with the stick. It really complicates the grappling game, which is good if you know what's going on, and bad if you've never seen it before.
Well, I mean, as you were saying, the thing about it. Okay, now I know you've had a really the successes you've had in jiu-jitsu competition are based as much sometimes on your desire to illustrate certain points. I remember you telling me that you were once at a tournament and you were trying to illustrate a particular you had created a lesson plan for something on video, and you wanted to have some things in the tournament that you would use to illustrate it, and so you were trying to not win a fight, but illustrate this technique and see how it was taught and how it was fought. And so you were running into trouble having with somebody who wasn't going along with your plan. Well, the reality is, for me anyway, that the one thing about for example, as you get better at executing arm bars, you also get better at stopping people from executing arm bars on you. So that's the thing. So if somebody's trying to do, like when somebody comes at you, I mean, somebody comes around and put their hand around your neck and they start driving into your neck with a with a butt end of their stick, and then it's really uncomfortable, and so you tap out. Well, a little while later, you're actually getting pretty good at this. I mean, the stopping of it. So you learn how to relax a bit. I mean, somebody has your arm in an arm bar. Well, I mean, you see people and they're able to stop you. They're able to stop themselves from getting hurt by these things, and because the things that hurt are you stiffening up and going, oh no, it's not, So so if you can relax and be soft enough, you can actually stop people from doing it.
And the little micro adjustments to
you can change things, and so and knife is no different. I mean, like what's the difference between if you were a fencer, for example, most of these things are like tick 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 bang, and one guy gets a score, but these are weapons that would not last in a battlefield situation. I mean, it's great. You have this 5-ounce épée or something like that, and it's great. So as long as the other guy has a weapon and everything's working electronically, we know that this guy won this match. And yeah, he got stabbed, but if you have if you're both fighting with rapiers and it's it's on the battlefield or in some situation where more people are there and somebody's got this big thing and they swing at you and you use your rapier to stop, and all of a sudden your rapier is no longer a rapier, it's kind of like a maybe a long dagger, and so that becomes a problem. So the weapons don't often last. The same way that bullets will misfire inside guns and explode and destroy the gun, or they'll jam and so you can't fire, or you'll get sand in your weapon and all sorts of stuff. Your blade you'll snap, and one of the big things when it came to the Dutch knew how to hit the Indonesian weapons at the Tang, and so they would break the things. And so great. People don't realize that when we all have these weapons that have come up, and bladed weapons must have been really horrendous at one time, and people figure out how to defend against them. When in the days when we had just muskets, we thought, wow, just imagine when bullets were invented. Like, wow, you can shoot right away. You don't have to spend a minute reloading. And then, you said more bullets and then you had Gatling guns. And my God, this is going to destroy everybody. And now you have, all sorts of electrically fired guns, and people adapt. So same thing. So if you never fought anybody, in a grappling situation with a weapon, you will probably find yourself getting your ass handed to you the first time if you fought somebody, because you don't have that experience. And then, look at now. Imagine if any of the mediocre, not even the good ones, the mediocre fighters fought if you take one guy who maybe has like a 5-5 record in the UFC and put him back in the original UFC, how do you think he's going to do?
Oh, he's going to, at the very least, make it to the finals.
Yeah, exactly. Why? Because he is the sum total of all that experience from all of those time periods, and not just he's not just saying, oh, I think maybe I can do this. It's like, no, nowadays they've managed to create this strange synthesis of attacking, and they've created ways from that attack into takedowns. I remember one of the things that amazed me with seeing Royce. He had that, kind of like that weird, like flip-floppy type of stance, almost kind of leaning back and your hands high in the air in this thing. And then he would do this kind of weird side kick. And it was so weird as a technique that the guys would look at it in kind of incredulous, like, awe, like, what the heck was that? And all of a sudden, this side kick would turn into some ridiculous technique. All of a sudden, bang, they would grab them. He was like run in, glom himself onto them, and then they kind of eventually pull the guy down so that he was on the ground. So either he'd pull the person down on top of them or pull him to the side. And then after that point, he would, because he had such great endurance, he would just slowly fight his way back to the top, and then the guy would either be armbarred or choked or something would happen. But that was the way it happened in those days. And then people figured out what not to do, and they figured out what not to give, and they figured out how to get away, and people adapted. And within the fighting now changes. So getting back to the original question, what about MMA? Well, MMA is probably the most adapted fighting system today, because it had to deal with that many. It wasn't like, well, we're going to add tickling today. So no, it was basically anything went. And nowadays there's of course 5 pages of rules at the UFC, and originally there was nothing. You could poke a guy in the eyes, you could kick him in the groin, you could grab and pull his hair. They don't do that anymore. But even then, like most of that kind of stuff would just anger most of the modern MMA fighters. If somebody was there and you tried pulling their hair, you would probably if the guy the guy would probably get really angry and try to kill you. So the sportiveness of it had been gone out.
Well, I'm just, as you're talking about the bladed confrontations, I remember the very first Indonesian Silat VHS tape instructional that I ever watched. Yeah, remember the VHS tapes? I think it was Herman Suwanda, but I could be wrong. It started with this guy with a knife and a guy without a knife. And I was like, oh, okay, it's going to be knife defense technique. So the guy with the knife, who I think was Herman Suwanda, comes in and stabs the guy without the knife, and he defends by grabbing the knife holder's wrist. At which point, it turns out this isn't actually a video about defending yourself against a knife. This is a video of what to do when you've got a knife and you're trying to stab somebody, and they have the audacity to try and stop you by grabbing you. Here's all the different ways that you can free yourself from the grappling situation and turn it back into basically assassination or murder, which just goes to show there's an entirely different mentality. But they do acknowledge that these kind of tie-ups can happen, and I would hazard a guess that these kind of tie-ups happen way more often nowadays than they would have 10, 15 years ago when you and I are going to have a fight. Okay, we'll stand back, and it'll be your sidekick against my, reverse punch. So as technology changes, you have to expect that almost, that, you have to expect the clinch. And if you're not sparring, okay, so you're a super deadly knife fighter. You're a deadly, 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 deadly knife fighter, but now you're in a clinch. That's fine. If all you want to ever do is knife, fill your boots. But for the love of God, make sure that you're doing some sparring on the ground with that knife. I think that it's an awful lot of fun to see people wrestling around and then throw a rubber or an aluminum knife on the mat and tell them that that's now in play. That really changes the grappling match. But what it doesn't change is the training method, which is still competitive, where you're trying to do something to someone and they're really trying to stop you. So we're kind of using the training method from Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu there, which is contested, constrained and contested competition. But now we're adding some of the, quote, combative elements into it. But we're still sparring it, as opposed to learning technique number 1, deadly killing technique number 2, and so on.
Well, I think that's the very fact that in jiu-jitsu you're doing the one thing, like your first thing you're trying to do is clinch onto somebody as hard as you can and, control them, to make them do something stupid, and then hopefully take advantage of that thing when they do that thing stupid, or you hope somebody grabs onto you incorrectly so you can base out and, counter that and find yourself in a more advantageous position. But I mean, getting back to the stick fighting, the one thing that Mark has been working on lately is this. He's been taking all of these things he's been doing, and he's been working on something they call die less often, the DLO stuff, so that they try to use some logical techniques, some trainable things, and make them work so that people will be able to use them in a real situation. Because that's always the problem with a sporty type of thing. Because the sport thing becomes the aim, the training of the sport becomes the aim, and the application in personal ability to execute against a number of variables stops becoming as important. I mean, your ability to do a jumping flying armbar is more important than your ability to stop a guy from punching you in the head. So you go, wow, okay, I can do that. Okay, that's great. You can do that. You can do a jumping flying armbar. You probably will never need that in a self-defense situation. But, in a jiu-jitsu tournament, that's a pretty good thing to have, because if somebody happens to be susceptible, you don't have to worry. So if you do your jumping armbar and the guy steps back and falls on the mat, that's all that's happened. He's not going to go over to the side of the mat, grab that folding chair and try to hit you with it. He's going to sit there and, he's going to have to, whatever he's going to do has to be within the context of the rules. And so that becomes, like, okay, well, but the guy who's trying the jumping armbar, well, he's a physically fit young person, so he's going to get that, he's going to find out whether or not that works, and maybe it's going to work, and maybe it's not, I mean, I remember how judo changed when Eastern Europeans started getting into it. That flying armbar thing actually was an advent. It was created and upgraded, but it was starting to be used by I think it was the East Germans. Yeah. The East Germans using it because they were able to, there were all these techniques that had been basically not started, but judo had started, but if you wanted to fight the Japanese on their turf, you couldn't do it. You couldn't just be a poor imitation of a Japanese fighter, because they had all of that stuff down. It's the way you had to do the new stuff. I mean, what it must have been like for the Brazilians to fight, BJ Penn. It must have been like really crazy, because, I mean, of course, they figured that they had, they were like the Canadians when it came to hockey. When they first fought the Russians, it was like, what do they think they are doing, playing hockey with us? So then all of a sudden, poof, hey, guess what? I have a plan, and the plan seems to be working. So hey, let's go. So when it comes to stuff like that, there's that. So when it comes down to the Dog Brothers, the one reality is that that people are now able to do things that they couldn't do before, and the reason is because if you know what you have to look forward to, you're not going to be spending any time wasting your time worrying about that stuff. You're going to know that, okay, if he grabs my legs, this is what I have to do. I'm either going to be successful or not successful, but this is what I have to do. If he grabs my chest and back, this is what I have to do. I can't serve, the big problem most people have is like, oh my God, he's grabbing something. What do I do? I mean, if you have no plan, if you don't have a sense of what you're supposed to do, I mean, the one thing that the UFC guys know is like, the guys who strike. I mean, Chuck Liddell was never known for being much of a grappler. I mean, he was known as a great grappler. He was a good wrestler in college, but he never really fought as a grappling fighter. He was a striker. But because of his grappling ability, his ability to stop people from grappling with him, well, then he was able to use his striking ability, until it stopped working for him. His striking ability was quite amazing, And I remember, those fights against Tito Ortiz. Tito would try to take him down, and he stuffed those takedowns, and then he would nail him. And as a result, Tito looked like he was, on paper, Tito looked like he was going to be the winner. And I remember when, Tito and Chuck Liddell fought, it was kind of like, yeah, these are the training partners, but it was kind of like you realized after a while that it was probably because Tito didn't want to get put into a box any more than anybody else did, or Chuck Liddell didn't want to be put into a box, he didn't want to be categorized as here's my sidekick. Well, no, I think he felt that he could win, and he evidenced by that. I think he won a couple of times, so it was a smart thing to do. But a lot of these guys, good grapplers, can use their grappling by just not grappling, by stopping the other person. Good stick fighters, they can use their grappling by doing that. I mean, like one of the things about stick fighting that a lot of people don't realize, and some of the smarter people who are fighting and learning how to stick grapple, is that grappling with a stick isn't just grappling with a stick. It's not like jiu-jitsu with a stick. It's like the reality is that you have an up to 30-inch extended lever in your hand that doesn't act as another phalange or another joint in your arm. It can detach, which is a very effective thing. It has no pain threshold to speak of, so it can be pushed and pulled and prodded, and it has a certain. I mean, like, for example, if you are at 6 feet in the air and you awkwardly fall on your arm, you can dislocate a shoulder or break an elbow or something like that. If your stick falls from 6 feet, it hits the ground, bounces, falls over, and you can pick it up again and use it. So it doesn't have any of the negatives other than the fact that somebody who can grab it out of your hand and throw it away. But if you're not inclined to let that happen, you can use it, and it's a very effective tool. But like anything else, I mean, the old joke of like, to a hammer everything looks like a nail. Well, that's the problem with with thinking that you can use the stick all the time. But you should be able to understandably use the thing effectively. You can use it once you start learning what leverage points there are. You can use that to effectively create a value-added effect. I mean, you could, for example, I've got a technique with like a kimura, like I guess what they call the chicken wing. You can use the stick in that lever and not put yourself in a position where, for example, if you want to do a kimura, you grab the wrist and you got to step over your arm, and basically you're turning your back to your partner for that, or for your opponent for that moment. But if you use a stick in the same regard, you position your wrist, push the stick on the inside on top of the wrist, and then pull. You have a really good lever, and you're not out of position. So you have a lot of things you can do that are better than what's available just by your arms. But it's like anything. You can't just say, "Well, that's what I'll do," any more than you can say, "Well, I'll just do that side kick to Mike Tyson's knee, and then he'll just fall down." So, well, no, you actually have to practice. You have to train it enough. You have to be there. Somebody proposed something once recently about that on one of the websites, and they're basically like, they every day talks about stick grappling, but when it's going to happen? Well, I basically wrote that it'll happen the same time that anything else happened. You have somebody who believes in its execution enough that they will do that in spite of somebody else's desire to stop them. They'll believe in it more, and they'll do it more, and then eventually their learning curve will get to the point where they'll start succeeding more often than they fail. and then you'll see people going, "Wow, this works." Because if Hoist had failed the first time, then the UFC would never have had this. It never would have gone where it is now. Because the only reason in my mind that the UFC was there is because it just defied everybody's perception of what was going to happen, and so then it kind of had a chance to grow. But had Hoist lost, had someone like a Tank Abbott or one of those enormous guys won, everyone would have said, "See, I knew that big guy was going to win. What did you expect?" It was the fact that it was a completely unexpected ending that made everybody go, "What?" And so,
and we'd all be power lifters now.
Yeah,
and beer drinkers,
because we all know that it's the best way to fight.
Yeah. Well, on that note, we're gonna wrap this interview up.
Okay.
So, Philip, if people want to train with you, either in the context of seminars or at your school, the Gelinas Academy of Martial Arts in Montreal, what's the best way to get a hold of you?
Well, we have an email address, montrealmartialarts@yahoo.ca, or they can call us. We're in the phone book, but it's for those who don't have a phone book, it's 514-281-9928, and we're open 7 days a week.
MontrealMartialArts.com?
That's correct.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. I've really enjoyed this chat. I don't think we followed any single idea in a linear fashion, but I really enjoyed it, so I'm hoping other people enjoy it as well.
Well, thank you very much for asking me on. I enjoyed it immensely.
Have a great night.
You too. Thank you very much.